Don't chase money. I did for 60 years, and here is where it got me. I need to say this plainly, without drama, without exaggeration, because at my age there's no benefit in pretending anymore. I chased money for 60 years, not casually, not occasionally. I built my entire adult life around it. Every major decision, every compromise, every delay was justified by the same belief. If I could just secure enough, everything else would eventually fall into place. That belief shaped who I became. And now, standing at the far end of that pursuit, I can finally see where it actually leads. When I was young, money didn't represent greed. It represented safety. I grew up watching adults worry in quiet, humiliating ways. Bills paid late, arguments whispered at night, plans canceled for reasons no one explained to children. I learned early that money wasn't about luxury. It was about dignity, and I promised myself I would never be at the mercy of uncertainty. So I worked, relentlessly. I didn't ask whether I liked the work. I asked whether it paid. I didn't ask whether it aligned with who I was. I asked whether it moved me closer to security. I told myself passion was a privilege for people who could afford to fail. I told myself I was being responsible, and the world rewarded me for that belief. Every year, the numbers improved. Titles followed. Respect arrived. People listened when I spoke. My life looked increasingly impressive from the outside, and that made it very easy to ignore the quiet discomfort growing on the inside. Discomfort doesn't scream when you're busy. It waits. I postponed a lot of things with the confidence of someone who believed time was obedient. I postponed rest. I postponed presence. I postponed joy. I told myself I would feel everything fully later, once the pressure was gone. I treated life like a holding pattern. That's the first lie money teaches you if you let it. That life can be delayed without consequence. For decades, I lived inside that lie. I woke up early. I stayed late. I said yes more than I should have. I said no to things that didn't translate into measurable progress. And every time I felt tired, or distant, or hollow, I reassured myself that it was temporary, that the discomfort was proof I was doing something important. What I didn't understand then is that exhaustion can feel meaningful while it's still moving you forward. But once the movement stops, exhaustion turns into something else. It turns into regret. Money became my metric for worth without me consciously choosing it. I measured my years by earnings, my success by accumulation, my safety by buffers. And slowly, subtly, everything that couldn't be monetized began to feel secondary. Conversations became shorter. Relationships became scheduled. Curiosity became inefficient. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold. I was just absent in a way that was socially acceptable. People rarely confront you when you're successful. They assume you know what you're doing. They assume the sacrifices are worth it. And so do you. That's how decades pass. The strange thing about chasing money is that it rarely feels like chasing. It feels like running toward responsibility, toward prudence, toward maturity. You tell yourself you're being an adult, that someday you'll slow down, that someday you'll enjoy what you've built. Someday is the most expensive word I ever believed in, because someday always moved. When I hit one milestone, another appeared. When I solved one fear, a more sophisticated one replaced it. Enough was never defined clearly, because if it were, the chase would have ended. I told myself I was securing my family, and in many ways, I did. But I also taught them something without meaning to. I taught them that availability was negotiable, that being busy was virtuous, that love could be expressed later. Those lessons linger longer than money ever does. As the years passed, I began to notice changes I didn't have language for at the time. I was less patient, less curious, less moved by small things. I needed bigger rewards to feel the same sense of progress. Money trains you to require escalation. What once felt like abundance slowly became baseline, and baseline quickly became insufficient. That's another truth people don't tell you. Money raises the floor, but it also raises the threshold for satisfaction. What used to feel like enough begins to feel normal, and normal begins to feel empty if it's not anchored to something deeper. I didn't realize how much of my identity was fused to earning until the earning slowed down. When my career plateaued, when the upward curve softened, I felt exposed. Not financially, internally. Without constant growth, I didn't know how to evaluate myself. That's a dangerous place to be in your later years. Because growth, at some point, stops being external. And if you've neglected internal growth for decades, you arrive at that moment unprepared. I had money, but I hadn't cultivated stillness. I had assets, but I hadn't built a relationship with time. I had freedom, but no practice using it. And when I finally stepped back, when the chase ended not by choice but by circumstance, the silence was louder than any stress I'd ever known. Without the pursuit, my days felt strangely thin. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I was unanchored. There was no urgency pulling me forward, no challenge sharpening my mind. The rewards I had trained myself to respond to were gone. That's when the question I had avoided for 60 years finally asked itself. Who am I if I'm not accumulating? I didn't have an immediate answer, and that scared me. I had believed money would give me freedom. What it actually gave me was comfort without direction. And comfort, when it stretches too long, becomes numbness. I began to see how many of my choices were defensive rather than expressive. I wasn't building toward a vision. I was shielding myself from fear of scarcity, fear of dependence, fear of being judged as irresponsible. Money had been my armor, but armor is heavy, and when you wear it too long, you forget what it feels like to move freely. I started to grieve things I had never consciously given up. Mornings without agendas, conversations without an endpoint, interests that didn't need to justify themselves. I realized I had treated anything that didn't generate value as a luxury instead of a necessity. That realization hurt, not because I had failed, but because I had succeeded in the wrong direction for too long. Chasing money trained me to delay my own humanity, to see rest as weakness, to see presence as inefficiency, to see life as something to optimize rather than inhabit. And optimization has a ceiling. At some point, there are no more gains, just maintenance. That's where I am now, maintaining what I built, maintaining health, maintaining relationships I didn't nurture as deeply as I could have, maintaining a sense of purpose that no longer comes automatically. I don't hate money, I respect it. It solved real problems. It removed real anxieties. It gave me options I would not otherwise have had. But it did not give me meaning. Meaning came later, slowly, painfully. When I had to rebuild parts of myself I neglected while chasing numbers. When I had to learn how to sit with time instead of outrun it. When I had to learn how to choose days based on how they felt, not how they paid. I had to unlearn the idea that worth is measured externally. That took longer than any business skill I ever learned. If I could speak to the younger version of myself, I wouldn't tell him not to earn. I wouldn't tell him to be reckless. I would tell him this instead. Don't let money become the reason you postpone becoming yourself. Earn what you need. Protect what matters. But don't confuse accumulation with arrival. Don't assume the chase itself is proof of a meaningful life. Because one day, the chase ends. And when it does, whatever you built inside yourself is what remains. I chased money for 60 years, and where it got me is here, safe, comfortable, and finally honest enough to admit that money was never supposed to be the destination. It was supposed to be a tool, and tools are only useful if you remember what you're building.